Hi, I'm Jim Brazil, and we're here today to talk about something really important, and that's your beneficiary designation. And we've talked a little bit recently about living trust and had a couple of videos that we've published and sent out to discuss the issues around living trust, but the beneficiary designation is extra important because not only does it have estate planning implications, but of course it is people's retirement account, and it has lifetime and living implications, how their IRAs are set up and how the beneficiaries are. And we want to focus on beneficiary designations today, and with that we're going to be working together on a team, and I want to invite in Jim Brazil, my dad, to work with us here.
It's amazing over the years how many people we've discussed about getting their estate plan together, and the beneficiary issue has been very important, but sometimes overlooked by us and by the people doing the documents, the attorneys. But recently we've seen some real problems in the designation of who the beneficiary is. And the big problem is the income taxation. You know, in retirement plans, when you take money out, it's fully taxable. When your heirs take money out, it's fully taxable. And there's some methods that we like to employ to lower the taxes and extend it over a lot of time, but we're finding that that's difficult if the designated beneficiary isn't done properly, Jim.
Yeah, so the act of picking your beneficiary really seems quite easy. It's a simple process. You're at the point of opening a bank account or an investment account or something, or maybe it's setting up your company 401k, and you're filling out the paperwork, and they list on there who do you want as your primary or contingent beneficiary. And you know, if you're married, it's usually your spouse that you'd put on there. And then if you have children, then maybe you'd list the children. But what we find happens is at that moment in time, it's treated more like a transaction, and some of the information that they may want on the form, the social security number, date of birth. Of course, you want to have the exact correct spelling. Sometimes that's not the simplest in a second marriage or whatnot. But in any event, you need to have all the information to complete the form, and so sometimes people maybe just list the primary and they don't list the contingent, put it in a drawer, and they never see it again. And that can create problems years later if for some reason the primary beneficiary passes away first and it's going to the contingents.
So one of the things that we see so often is particularly a beneficiary designation with no contingent. But even if there is a contingent, there's some other problems in filling that out. But let's go back to what we're trying to do. You have to think about this. All the money in those retirement accounts, 401k, 403b, IRAs, all that money is going to be taxable when it comes out. So it's pretty easy during your lifetime. You've all heard that there's a required minimum distribution when you hit 70.5, and you go through the details. But when your heirs get it or your spouse gets it, there's some different rules. What we're trying to do here is to teach you some things about how to reduce the amount of taxes that are going to be paid on your different accounts. And therein really lies a problem, depending on who that primary beneficiary is, and Jim, who that contingent beneficiary is.
Okay, so let's say that you've set up your primary beneficiary and you've done what a lot of people think is the right thing to do. They've left it to their living trust. After all, they spent a lot of time going to the lawyer, drafting it. It's got just what they want in there, and they think, well, shouldn't I leave it to the living trust either as the primary or the contingent? Let's say they left it to their spouse, the spouse predeceases them, and the contingent is the living trust. Well, that in itself presents a big problem, because there's some special tax advantages to IRAs when they're left to individuals versus a trust. If they're left to an individual, those individuals can stretch out the payments over their life expectancy. So all of the money in an IRA is tax deferred, and they don't want to have it all come out immediately or within 5 years, which there's a 5-year rule of having to distribute. But by putting it in a trust, they more than likely have just created that problem where the entire IRA becomes taxable within 5 years.
So let's just throw a number. Let's say we have a $500,000 IRA 401k beneficiary on an annuity. It's $500,000, and there's $500,000 in a retirement plan that's going to be taxable when it's taken out and you leave it to your living trust, because like Jim said, you spent all the time putting it together and you know exactly that. That trust is not a designated beneficiary. So that trust, when it receives the IRA beneficiary, it must be distributed out of the trust to the other beneficiaries within 5 years. Or the trustee may decide to get it all out once. What if there's one beneficiary of your living trust and they receive in a taxable year $500,000 of additional income tax taxable on top of their other income? What if it comes out over 5 years and it's $100,000 extra a year? Let's say you're in the 28-29% tax bracket and that $100,000 gets kicked up into the next bracket. We have seen some big disasters in income tax planning simply because of the not thinking through the contingent and primary beneficiaries, Joe.
Yeah, and another potential beneficiary that we know people use in retirement accounts is leaving it to a charity. I mean, after all, if there is a huge deferred tax inside the IRA, people might decide, well, why don't I leave part of the IRA to charity in addition to their family members? And we've read about a lot of problems when people have tried doing this, because remember, the charity, it's not a natural person. It does not have a life expectancy. And so you end up in that situation potentially causing a problem for all of the beneficiaries of that IRA to lose the ability to stretch it out over time. And so all the individuals, either spouse, children, or grandchildren, no longer can stretch out or defer their IRA withdrawal and would owe taxes within the 5 years. No problems for the charity because they obviously don't owe any income tax.
So when we look at the different issues of naming beneficiaries, one of the areas that's easy to get into, which almost all families have the problem, your kids don't seem to have the same number of grandchildren. So you go in and name your spouse as the primary beneficiary. That's good. Now the spouse has some choices on how to take the IRA. Then you name a group of contingent beneficiaries. And then you're faced with a dilemma. What happens if some of the contingent beneficiaries pass away? What happens to the amount of money that they have, Jim, designated to them on the beneficiary forms?
Well, now you've done it. We've got to brush up on our Latin, and I'm going to need to get out my reading glasses to go over these beneficiary designations, because the devil is really in the details. Here is a sample of a major custodian. And when you fill out the form, their traditional IRA application, they just have a list of all the beneficiaries you can put down. But in addition to that, you need to decide whether you're going to check the box per stirpes, which I'm sure we all know what per stirpes means. And it doesn't say if you don't check the box per stirpes what's going to happen on this form. But don't worry, the document's about 20 pages. You can read back there and it'll say what happens. And so let me just read a couple things to you. It says per stirpes information. If your beneficiary designation is per stirpes, you understand that if your beneficiary dies before you, the beneficiary's share of the IRA will pass to his or her respective heirs. In the field below, please provide the name of the individuals responsible to advise custodian on any questions related to the per stirpes distribution of the IRA. You understand that the per stirpes instructions given to the custodian by the responsible individual named above shall be binding on all beneficiaries of the IRA and your estate and may be relied on by custodian. Custodian shall not be liable for any payment made at the direction of this individual. If you do not name a responsible individual, or the individual you named is unwilling or unable to advise custodian on questions regarding per stirpes, then you understand that custodian will rely on instructions from your executor of the estate. I'm not sure what could possibly go wrong in filling out that distribution, but it does point out the fact that you really have to be careful what it says, and this really isn't a simple transaction, a simple quick thing to not read a little bit, but it's something to make sure you get good advice when setting up your beneficiary designations.
What's interesting is we're looking at some statistics that in the country, upwards of 50% of inherited wealth is going to come to heirs through designated beneficiaries in retirement plans and annuities. So now let's go back, Jim, and think. All this emphasis has been on putting the living trust together, putting all the living trust details together, and yet half of the assets across the country are coming through this. Now what's really interesting is this per stirpes, because very few people are going to feel comfortable of checking the per stirpes box. And like you said, if it isn't per stirpes, what is it? So it's per capita or it's per stirpes. You check for per stirpes, but you've got to have a designated person. If you don't check, is it per capita? What do you think, Jim?
Well, don't worry whether it's per stirpes or per capita, because we're just reading the example from one form. Each company has their own form, and they may default to either per stirpes, per capita, or they may come up with some other default mechanism.
I think the most general thing that's going to happen in our experience is the companies are going to look at the form. If the person's not alive that's named there, they're going to look to see if there's a contingent. If the contingent's not there, then they're going to look at the state that the thing was done in, and they're probably going to pay it out to the estate through the probate process, which is going to cause 100% of the deferred income taxes to be paid, probably within 5 years for sure, and maybe even on the first given year. So understanding a little bit more about how to protect your heirs from overpaying massive amounts of income tax, Jim, seems to be almost as important as getting the living trust right.
So in looking at the beneficiary designation and the importance of it, it is right up there with the importance of drafting your living trust properly. And in fact, as Dad just said, about half of the wealth is in some sort of retirement account, deferred income type assets, qualified plans, annuities, and IRAs. And so we really need to be careful in how these things are set up. We've covered a few of the issues that you want to avoid. But we haven't really talked about yet is one of the main purposes of some people's estate plan is to minimize creditor risk, asset protection. And we haven't talked at all about how that can be done in an IRA, leaving it to individuals. And so although trusts create problems when it's just a basic living trust as a beneficiary, there are some ways to structure it so that you can get that creditor protection. So we need to talk about that, I think, a little bit more in another beneficiary video, probably beneficiary number 2. And in addition, to really dive into a little more detail about the great benefit of stretching out the income tax obligations over time rather than having it just taken all out within 5 years. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at beneficiary video number 2.